story, and then we would love to hear any of your questions or comments. It's about a neighbor of mine that I'd like to introduce you to. So here it goes. You couldn't help but stare. When you saw her, it was a cliche. Your jaw dropped. It was as if an old crone had stepped right out of a medieval fairy tale. The year was 2000. I just bought my home in Evanston. It was a small one-story cottage tucked into the trees off Broadway Avenue. Actually, the front of my house is on the alley facing Broadway, right by Central Street and Green Bay Road. And there, standing in front of my new home, was this ancient-looking woman, a babushka wrapped around her head, tied forward in front of her face, so just the tip of her long nose was peeking out for her profile. Layers of dusty, dirty, smock-type dresses, some frayed, some torn, all gray or brown in color, with a navy blue sweatshirt on top, and a clump of keys strapped across her chest that she confided in me later, evened her out after a mastectomy so she wouldn't topple over. She had a walking stick or a branch of a tree, I'm not sure which, and she was bent over talking to my new next door neighbors, Greg and Michael. Who was she? What was she? I came to find out her name was Ruth Marito, and she lived just 4 doors down from me at the end of our alley, the front of her house right across from the Metro train tracks. Several nights later, other new neighbors, Jeff and Bernice, filled me in on more of Ruth's history. They had met Ruth 5 years earlier in 1995 when they moved onto our block. Her dress was a bit disheveled back then, they told me, but not as classically crone-like yet. When they met Ruth, she still drove. She had an old station wagon with faux wood paneling on the side. The car was stuffed full of books and cardboard and nondescript papers, the first signs of her hoarding. Ruth worked as a bus driver, and before that as a security guard, complete with uniform and badge, and even as a nursing assistant. Back then she was able to shop at Dominic's or order food from the Chinese restaurant on Green Bay. She loved to shop at all the stores on Central Street, especially the Dancing Bear, where she'd show off a ring or bracelet she had just bought. Then Bernice had an accident, shattered her ankle, was laid up for weeks. That's when Ruth showed up one day bearing several paintings of outdoor fields, mountains, and forests. So you can look at something while you have to stay inside, Ruth said. Bernice did not realize until Ruth left that the lovely paintings, were signed by none other than Ruth herself, Ruth Marito. For years, it turned out, she had been an artist. A little investigation proved she'd been an artist. She used to set up camp on Central Street, painting covered bridges and cityscapes and outdoor scenes of trees and flowered fields and waterfalls, and talking to anybody who walked by. When I moved in, Ruth was no longer working. She stood in front of her house, watching more than tending her garden of native flowers and grasses, which meant her front and backyards were filled with shoulder-high weeds, along with the native plants that she clipped and shared with neighbors. She had a dog back then, too, a little wire-haired dachshund named Sean. She came by to let Sean visit Jeff and Bernice's dog, Archie. She sent them cards and long notes about what Sean had done that day or what he had to say to his friend Archie. And sometimes she brought Sean down to visit my dog, Sophie, or we'd meet in the alley walking our dogs, and she'd talk nonstop. Then slowly over time I noticed she started to slip in little phrases such as, "I won't drive my car anymore, it's bugged." And I'd say, "Have to go, Ruth? Gotta get dinner going." And she'd follow me down the alley and keep right on talking. Now somewhere in there is when Team Ruth unofficially began. For people realized that as her mind began to slip more and more, she wasn't taking care of herself. Jeff and Bernice regularly gave her peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, her favorite. Greg and Michael slipped her money. Anytime I brought canned goods by her house, I'd see bags of canned goods already there. Even as her dementia and paranoia grew, her trust in Jeff and Bernice increased. She actually let Jeff in her house to change light bulbs or check a faucet or drain. This was unheard of. Nobody but Ruth's dogs and cats were allowed in. And Jeff could see that the hoarding in the house was getting out of control. She also told Jeff that Frank Lloyd Wright had wanted her to study with him. that her minister father had said no because Frank Lloyd Wright already had a well-established reputation as a ladies' man. And she told Jeff that her husband, a Japanese American, had worked for Army intelligence during World War II, and that he still attended secret meetings in Chicago after the war. And once Ruth was invited, and at this secret meeting she met famous people such as Tokyo Rose, which well could be true since the woman known as Tokyo Rose did settle in Chicago after the war. See, that was always the dilemma. After you talked with Ruth, you had to wonder, what was true? Some of the stories were verifiable. Ruth's father was a distinguished Methodist minister in Washington, D.C., where Ruth was born. He was a well-known peace activist and had a room dedicated to his efforts against both world wars at the United Nations. Ruth had lived in that house for over 50 years, the longest standing residence on the block, and she had been living without family of any kind since the mid-1970s. As more care was needed and her dementia progressed, a core group of teen Ruthers moved into high gear, buying her diapers, bringing her to doctor's visits, picking up medicines, ordering Meals on Wheels, cleaning up the rubble outside her house. And Ruth paid in kind by creating these enormous wreaths of twigs and dried flowers for neighbors, sending a card or just making people laugh or brightening their day with her compliments. She noticed everything people wore, pointed out when your color combinations were particularly agreeable, and still flirted with a twinkle in her eye. "Is he married?" she asked me one day when I mentioned a gentleman I was working with. "Yes, Ruth, he's married," I had answered. She hissed right back, "Aw, nuts." On Christmas Eve 2009, after Jeff and Bernice noticed that the backs of her shoes were bent because Ruth couldn't easily get in and out of her shoes, they showed up at her door with a solution, a pair of slip-on Crocs. That's when they noticed that she had a huge inflammation, an infection in her leg. She wouldn't trust an ambulance, so they wrapped her up in a blanket and took her to the hospital. Eventually, Ruth was moved to Manor Care Nursing Home in Wilmette. Team Ruth swung again into high gear. A pro bono attorney was found for Ruth, and eventually Ruth gave Jeff financial power of attorney. Upon opening her mail, Jeff discovered that Ruth was only months away from losing her house because of back taxes. If Ruth's back taxes were sold off to financial companies, she would never be free and clear to sell her home, pay off her debts, or even fund a funeral. Miraculously, another neighbor stepped forward to pay the back taxes, over $30,000, with absolutely no contract, just a shake of the hand, so that Ruth would not lose her one investment. With the taxes paid, Jeff was free to contest her tax payments over the years and actually got a fair amount of them back. That allowed him to make a modest deposit into her checking account to fund her stay at Manor Care. While all this was going on, I'd see neighbors walking down the alley with buckets and scrub brushes, doing their best to wade through the garbage and make the house inhabitable in case Ruth ever could return. Capturing Ruth's cat, and I was part of this adventure, took over a year. Because that cat had multiple hiding places in that rubbish-filled house and had litter boxes of its own making everywhere. But Ruth was never able to return to her home and finally succumbed to multiple health issues at the nursing home. Ruth's memorial service was held on a Sunday this February at the First Methodist Church where Ruth had once been a member. Neighbors stood and talked about the jokes shared and the kindnesses Ruth had showed them and others had shown her. Some parents had discovered upon her passing that their children and teenagers had been won over by Ruth as well. Once they got past how she looked, they had been easily coaxed by her charms to help with a little snow shoveling, pulling weeds, or taking out the garbage. Ruth had been interested in their lives, and they had responded, as all of us had, with actually enjoying helping her out. After the services, Ruth's now clean, white, sparkling, rehabbed house was a gathering for desserts and drinks. The house had been rehabbed and sold. All of Ruth's bills were paid because the neighbors had saved the house. Ruth's friend filled the house that rainy Sunday afternoon after the service, including the young couple and their baby, who would be its next tenants at the first of the month. And the entire unfurnished house was filled with scores of her paintings that neighbors took home with them. Many were learning for the first time that Ruth had been an artist. Together, Ruth's neighbors shared Ruth's stories, separating as best we could fact from fiction, but in the end, knowing that we had met one of life's true characters, as memorable as the images of the mysterious and magical crones whose stories have passed down from generation to generation for hundreds of years. Couple of pictures that I do have. Here's Ruth as a young woman. Really lovely. And this is when she was sitting on Central. Somebody snapped a picture of her painting on Central. I do not have any of the crone pictures, but I kind of like that we don't. Nobody had any. Because this is her at Manor Care with Bernice after she was all cleaned up, and all of us were like, what? It was so lovely to see her, but she always had that impish grin. It was just that it was under a lot of stuff, you know what I mean? And here are a few of her paintings. Beautiful landscapes. It's so interesting that her house got more and more crowded, but she painted these open vistas of all kinds. And this is the one I took home with me. But they're just really lovely paintings. Okay, so what I want to say is, again, we never know who we're living next to, and the kindnesses that neighbors pay one another, you know, no matter how we come. And these were two stories of people who were longtime residents of the North Shore, but we also have stories of people who came here literally with the clothes on their back, escaping war or whatever, and were treated with the same kind of kindnesses. And so we're hoping to collect these stories so we can break up that image of North Shore and really show the positive stories of it being a welcoming neighborhood. And this is what Open Communities is really about, saying this is a welcoming place, this is a diverse place. We are here for each other because every one of us needs that feeling of belonging. Every single one of us needs to feel like we're known. And by sharing our stories, we really truly believe we can do that.